And the other angle of this, which we need to talk about here, is, of course, the angle of Nancy Pelosi, right? Because Nancy Pelosi leaned in to endorse Joe Kennedy against Ed Markey, who she had worked with in the House for years and years and years. And that was against the rules, right? Because you remember that blacklist thing where it was said that no one was allowed to endorse against an incumbent, right? And that if you do that, then you're going to be blacklisted. You can't get strategist, and any strategist who tries to endorse against an incumbent or work for, and this is something which affects Democratic strategists across the country. If you work for a campaign running against an incumbent, you are blacklisted. And that means that no campaign is allowed to hire you who's working with the DCCC. And so, for Nancy Pelosi to come out and do something like that, to make an endorsement, well, it just opened up the floodgates. And it was shortly after that that AOC said, well, this is BS on Twitter. And then within 24 hours of putting out that tweet, made an official endorsement of Ed Markey, who, by the way, Ed Markey, it's not like we were surprised by that, right? Ed Markey was the first person who took AOC truly seriously, took her idea of the Green New Deal and said, you know what, I'm going to put a version of this in front of the Senate for everyone. And I'm going to help you write this bill. I'm going to help you work with that bill. That was one of the early things of AOC's political career in Congress. Yeah. So it's not, I suppose, surprising in that respect that AOC turned around and endorsed Ed Markey, right? But it does show you that, once Nancy Pelosi did that, once Nancy Pelosi broke that rule, once Nancy Pelosi said, actually, that rule doesn't really apply in all particular situations, et cetera, that was the moment when AOC came out and endorsed. And it's actually a moment when we saw a number of other progressive organizations come out and endorse as well, because it meant, well, this blacklist thing, that's nonsense. So I actually do think that this is a pretty important race in that respect, because it probably means that that blacklist is just not going to get enforced, right? Because if that doesn't get enforced, that means that Democratic strategists across the country who, maybe have been working for more establishment campaigns, but maybe a little bit more on the left, they're going to feel more open. They're going to feel more open to move into those progressive candidates and work for those more progressive candidates who maybe they're like, well, I'd like to work for those candidates, but I also need to make sure that I can keep food in my belly, So it's a big deal, I think.
Yeah, and I think that what you just talked about with Nancy Pelosi is that that, and then what Schumer was doing and what Kentucky, I think it really shows that the progressives, you kind of think of the progressives, not really, a lot of progressives don't really think of themselves as members of the Democratic Party, but they you think there's this friendliness sometimes between the Democratic Party and progressives. And this is one more instance where I think it's not. It's kind of an all-out, the Democrats don't really like the progressives because they keep coming out and endorsing against that, even when it's, against tradition to do that kind of thing. So even kind of fighting upstream in order to make sure that progressives aren't gaining ground. And I think this is good evidence for people who are progressive or more left to look and go, you know what, the Democratic Party it's not like they're going to come around and then support progressive ideals. So we kind of talked about this a few months ago when Kyle Kalinske came out and said, well, I'm not going to vote for Biden because I don't like this deal or whatever. And I think that's part of the reason there's this People's Party movement right now is basically putting the Democrats on notice and saying, look, you're probably going to get our vote this time so we can get past Trump, but you're kind of on notice. If you stay with this central Democrat idea, you're going to lose a lot of us. And
they're not coming back.
You can't take that vote for granted. You can't keep working against the candidates that we want, or why would we stick around in your party? And I think there's going to be a big change in things in the next 4 years as the younger voters who are more, willing to be more progressive and left-leaning age into that group that votes more. And then we see the development of this People's Party. I think you're going to start seeing those old people like Schumer and Pelosi hopefully getting replaced and that kind of old style thinking going away.
And, when she made that announcement that she was endorsing, she just talked about families. She said that she's worked with, I can't remember the number, but she came up with a number of Kennedys that she'd worked with in the past, how she's worked with her, his uncle and all these things about all the Kennedys and how, her father worked with Kennedys as well. That was her reason for endorsement. It's not like, oh, that was the reason, but then she said something else. No, that was the reason that she said. That's what she came out and said, which was just terrible political maneuvering. But the fact
Right.
that she had to come out and make that endorsement, I think, does show that there are parts of the Democratic Party that is worried about the progressive
Mm,
side of things,
right.
right? They're worried. So they're like, well, let me make this endorsement. Now, I don't know that the endorsement helped. Maybe it did. Maybe it didn't. I don't really know. I mean, that's a question. It's hard to tell, right? But
Right.
regardless, in the long run, I think it did hurt because, as we were mentioning there earlier, it means that that blacklist thing there is nonsense. It means that it's not
Right.
actually going to get enforced because what are they going to enforce it against Nancy Pelosi? They're going to say that Nancy
Right.
Pelosi can't work with Democratic strategists anymore.
Right.
Well, maybe. I mean, then Nancy Pelosi won't have a campaign against Shahid Buttar, but right. But I doubt it. That's not going to happen, right?
Right.
It means that the blacklist isn't going to get enforced, which means that there's going to be even more Democratic strategists moving in to work with progressive candidates. And there are young Democratic strategists out there who might be interested in something like that. And I think that that's one of the major lessons to take away from tonight. That the blacklist is BS. That there are going to be more strategists moving in, more resources moving into progressive camps than there were before, specifically because of this race tonight. So that's a big deal. That's a really, really big deal.